Good morning to everybody in attendance. My name is Dane Sprankle. I'm with the PA OSHA Consultation Program. I'm doing this webinar today on the two topics showing at the top of the slide, the revised Silica regulation and the Region 3 Focus 4 Hazards campaign will also be addressed toward the end of the webinar. With regard to the revised Silica regulation, what I'm going to present today is an overview of the key points of the new regulation, and possibly down the road we will offer some more detailed webinar on specific aspects of the Silica regulation. But for today, again, because of the amount of information, it'll be an overview of both the general industry, maritime, and construction standards. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. I'm not sure how soon that'll be, but it will be available at some point for if you're unable to, if you know somebody that was unable to attend and would like to watch it. And we are open, the chat room is available for questions. Please go ahead and submit any questions that you have as we're going through the information here today. Because of the potential complexities of questions involving this standard, we will be providing answers to your questions on our website within 7 days of the webinar today. So you'll need to check back to our website shown in the previous slide to see what the answers to the questions were. And we're also available after today. Typically, if there's a webinar question that can be answered quickly, if you prefer to call, you can call myself or call the program tomorrow, and somebody would likely be able to answer the quicker, simpler questions. But for the more complex ones, again, we'll post all questions on the website with answers within 7 days of the webinar today. The objectives that we have for today, as I said, we're going over the key aspects of the revised Silica regulations, and that would include the dates for compliance, the key requirements. And again, I want to reiterate, this is not a comprehensive review. This is more to let you know the areas that will need to be addressed for companies and businesses that are impacted by this regulation. And then again, I'll be providing a brief description of OSHA's Region 3 Focus 4 campaign, for just to let you know what that's all about and how to participate in that. So with regard to the Silica regulation, why was it changed, or why was it modified? Basically, the current standard is based on data from many years ago, 50+ years, and the OSHA standard that is in effect currently does not adequately, based on ongoing issues with health problems that have been exhibited by employees, workers over the years, even where they have been working in environments where exposures were controlled at or below the existing OSHA limits. There continue to be health issues such as silicosis, and even lung cancer, kidney issues, etc. And that's in environments where the existing standard has been met. So obviously that showed that there's a need for a change, and so there are other agencies that have for years advocated a lower exposure limit, such as ACGIH, and OSHA has moved more in line with what their recommendations are with the new standard. And also there is better technology available now for compliance to reduce exposures, more achievable ventilation, water systems, etc. So lower limits are more achievable today than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that, as far as why the standard was changed, those were all factors in that decision making. And there's basically two different standards that came out of the rulemaking. The general industry and maritime is covered under 1910.1053, and construction is covered under 1926.1153. As far as compliance dates, there's a lot of different dates here for the different industries and for various aspects of the standard itself. So I'm just going to kind of read through these, and keep in mind that you want to refer back depending on what industry you're in to make sure you're in line or on track to meet the compliance dates that apply to you. So for general industry maritime, the standard, the first compliance date is June 23rd of 2018, and that date is the date by which all obligations have to be met except for the medical surveillance requirement. And the medical surveillance requirement kicks in on 6/23/2020. And then kind of a sub-industry within that standard would be the hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas. And there's 3 different compliance dates for that industry. 6/23/2018 is all obligations of the standard except for engineering controls and medical surveillance. 6/23/2020 is when the medical surveillance requirements have to be met where applicable. And then 6/23/2021, engineering controls have to be implemented. For the construction industry, 6/23/2017, which we're only talking like roughly 3 months from now, all obligations except for methods of sample analysis. And 6/23/2018, methods of sample analysis have to be met. Again, that would be where it's applicable. All right, so looking at the general industry and maritime standard, there's a link right there to go right to the OSHA website, to the standard itself. And it applies to everything except for the bulleted items there. Construction work, as I mentioned, is covered or will be covered under the construction standard. Agricultural operations, processing of sorptive clays, and that's a very specialized type of clay for things like cat litter and oil dry, things like that. Those are exempted. For companies that have objective data showing that exposures can never exceed the action level, again, that would be exempted or accepted. And if a company that's normally under general industry, if they have an operation or a task that is non-routine that they're doing, maybe with a building upgrade or a small repair project. If it is a listed construction task, which we'll go over that when we get to the construction standard, if it's a listed task and the requirements of that task are met, and again, it's non-routine, it's not a normal process, those situations would be exempted as well or accepted from the general industry standard. And here's a list of examples of industries that would fall under the general industry or maritime. This is obviously not a comprehensive list. I'm sure there's many more, but you know, I think if you look down through that, there's probably a few there that jump out at you. It's maybe a little surprising, like jewelry production, for example, dental laboratories. So the standard does have a wide-reaching impact across many industries. So if there's silica or potential, then the industry is potentially impacted by the standard. All right, now moving into the key provisions. The exposure limits, the current exposure limit, as you can see there, it's based on respirable dust containing crystalline silica, and it's not a fixed number. It varies depending on the percent of silica in the sample taken. So the formula is 10 divided by a percent of silica 10 divided by percent of silica plus 2. So as you see there, with the percentage being on the bottom of the equation, the higher the percentage of silica, the lower the exposure limit. But it would vary depending on, again, how much silica is actually present in the respirable dust. The new limits do not have any variation. There are fixed limits, and there are actually two. There's an action level and a PEL, and the action level is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, and the PEL is 50 micrograms. And keep in mind that's micrograms, it's not milligrams, so that's a much smaller unit than the milligrams referenced in the current standard. Okay, to determine what the exposures actually are, obviously that's going to kind of be the starting point for determining what you need to do, if anything, for control options. And you're provided two options there: a performance option, which would be any combination of objective data and air monitoring that you're able to either do or locate. The objective data is a little tricky or complex to use because of the variation that occurs. Objective data would be based on a specific situation, specific configuration of a workroom or a work area, and a known amount of ventilation, etc. And so any data that you may find that would tell you or would suggest that in this particular environment this is what the exposure would be, it would have to be very specific and directly comparable to the work environment that you're using that data to represent. So obviously that option it's there, but it's probably not the most desirable way to go. And then so the second option there is the scheduled monitoring, and that's the typical approach where you do initial exposure monitoring and then repeat monitoring if necessary. The repeat monitoring is required depending on the initial result. If it's above the permissible exposure limit, then every 3 months thereafter, follow-up monitoring would have to be completed. And if the initial monitoring is above the action level but below the PEL, the repeat monitoring has to be done every 6 months. And the discontinuing monitoring, basically you would have to continue doing the monitoring at the frequencies identified there until you do 2 sets of consecutive, you have 2 consecutive sets of results that are at least 7 days apart that are below the exposure limit, whether it be the action level or the PEL. So if you get one result that's below the limit, you still need to do at least one more set of monitoring at least 7 days later to confirm that result was not just an anomaly. But if you do get those two sets and the conditions were representative of normal operating conditions, then at that point you can discontinue the monitoring. Okay, another key provision of the new standard is the establishment of regulated areas. If your monitoring reveals, or if you're using objective data, if the results indicate that exposures are or are anticipated to be above the PEL, you have to establish a regulated area for that work area. And it has to be demarcated in some way to make sure that people can't walk in without knowing that they just entered a regulated area. Warning signs have to be posted, and the language of the signs is in the next slide. And access, again, has to be limited through either barriers or some method that will prevent people from walking in without knowing that it's a regulated area. And respiratory protection has to be mandatory in a regulated area. The language for the signs is identified there, and this is right out of the standard. So if you do have to establish a regulated area, you need to post signs that contain that wording. Methods of compliance. There's 3 listed there: engineering and work practice controls, written exposure control plan, and abrasive blasting is kind of a separate category. I'm going to go over each of those 3 points. For engineering and work practice controls, depending on what your initial monitoring reveals, if you're above the PEL, you do have to attempt engineering and work practice controls to reduce exposures to the fullest extent feasible. And that's the best option, is to engineer or through work practices eliminate the hazard to the maximum extent that you can before you can rely on respiratory protection as a long-term exposure control. Examples of engineering and work practice controls: substitution of the silica containing product, if that's something that can be done. Obviously, if you're in an industry where you manufacture a product that contains silica, that is not an option for you. But for example, abrasive blasting, if you're using a silica containing product, if you can substitute it with something that does not contain silica. Wet methods is another option. That's if you can't substitute the product, using wet methods is probably the best and most effective method. Anytime you can get water on the dust, that's going to prevent it from getting airborne. Isolation of the process that's where the silica, the airborne silica, is being produced is an option, or isolating the employees through distance or barriers, etc. Any employees that don't need to be in or near such an area can be relocated if possible. Exhaust ventilation is another option, another engineering control, and that's another good option as well. There's a lot of different types of systems available, that anything from devices that attach directly to a handheld grinder to larger fixed systems that would be located maybe next to a large commercial saw or something like that, where wet methods aren't achievable. So local exhaust is a good option, and then general dilution ventilation, just providing as much fresh air as possible. And that's not a complete list. There's obviously more engineering work practice controls, but those are probably the most common ones. Okay, and there's also a requirement to develop a written exposure control plan if there is silica, airborne respirable silica in the workplace. It does have to be prepared, and it has to be in writing, and it has to be reviewed and updated at least annually. And that plan would describe the tasks within that work area or that facility that are covered, anywhere, again, where there's potential exposure to silica. And also describe the exposure controls for each operation where there's airborne silica. And it will also describe housekeeping measures that have to be taken to control the accumulations of dust, and not only the housekeeping measures, but how to do the housekeeping safely without creating additional exposures. In abrasive blasting, it has some additional requirements that are already in effect. That the new standard doesn't relieve the obligation to comply with those other standards, and they're listed down at the bottom there: 1910-94, 1915.34, and 29 CFR 1915 subpart 1. Those obviously those three don't apply in every industrial application, but especially the 1915 would be more maritime. But those standards are already in effect, and the new silica standard does not eliminate the obligation to continue compliance with those other standards. All right. For respiratory protection, the standard, the general industry maritime standard, as well as the existing OSHA respirator standard, which is 1910.134, both would apply. And the respirators, as mentioned earlier, are required where the exposures exceed the PEL, and that would be any time if the initial exposure monitoring reveals the exposures in excess of the PEL, and while you're working on implementing engineering and work practice controls, you have to continue or require and continue to require respiratory protection. If there's a specific task, some maintenance task may not allow for the implementation of engineering work practice controls, and so during those types of tasks you would have to require respiratory protection. And then if all feasible engineering and work practice controls have been attempted and exposures have been reduced to the maximum extent achievable, and they're still above the PEL, then at that point, again, respiratory protection would need to continue to be mandatory, and that would be at that point on a long-term basis in conjunction with the engineering and work practice controls that have already been implemented. And then within a regulated area as well, respiratory protection is required, and that would be for anybody that would enter those areas, including people that would go in to observe, monitoring. That would be any workers that are in that area, or any outsider from that may be on site and be permitted in the regulated area. Some general provisions regarding housekeeping. The dry sweeping is not something you should do, obviously, with any dust, but in particular with silica containing dust. So wet sweeping or HEPA vacuuming has to be implemented or attempted unless it's not feasible. I think the majority of situations would permit the wet sweeping or HEPA vacuuming, but if it's not feasible, and that's something you would have to make sure that you have documentation as to why it's not feasible, you would have to do the sweeping wet or HEPA vacuum. And then compressed air cleaning, if that's not permitted unless it's done with an effective ventilation system. That would be, again, I think it would be difficult to capture the amount of dust, airborne dust that might be created by compressed air cleaning. But that's permitted only if there's no alternative method and you have an effective way to capture the dust. Medical surveillance under the general industry and maritime standards, it's required anytime exposures exceed the action level for 30 or more days per year. And the examination schedule, baseline exam has to be completed within 30 days of initial assignment for an employee to an area where the exposures, again, would exceed the action level for 30 plus days per year. And minimum follow-up exams have to be completed at least every 3 years. And any additional examinations that are recommended by the initial examining physician, even if it's less than 3 years, would have to be completed. And that could be the pulmonologist or any other specialty physician. In the general subjects that have to be addressed with the general exam that has to be completed by the physician would include medical and work history, physical, a chest x-ray, pulmonary function test, and a TB test. And that's the minimum. Again, any specialized tests, additional tests, or if the physician recommends the employee be examined by a specialist, that would be in addition to the basic medical exam. Okay, communicating the hazards of silica. Silica, if it's present in the workplace, does have to be included in the company's hazard communication program. And like all other requirements of hazard communication, for silica containing products, you have to have safety data sheets, and it has to be labeled appropriately under the GHS requirements that are already in existence. And the employees have to, at a minimum, have to be aware of the health effects, bullet of their cancer, lung effects, immune system effects, kidney effects, and any additional hazards that you would want to include. The training, this would be specifically for silica exposures for the employees that are in areas where there's exposure. They have to be apprised of the items listed there. So we already talked about the health hazards. Using the exposure control plan, that was developed under the requirements of the standard. You would describe the covered task again through a training session, exposure controls that are in place, and the contents of the standard and the medical surveillance requirements, so that employees understand all those 5 different areas. And that's training, again, that would be in addition to the hazard communication training. So that's something that you want to make sure that the employees that are within or potentially within the exposed areas are well aware of those requirements. And then record keeping with regard to Silica related issues, in line with, it has to be in compliance with the existing record keeping requirements of OSHA under 1910.1020, and that would include air monitoring data, any objective data if that is used as part of your exposure evaluation, and medical surveillance records provided by examining physicians. Okay, now moving on to the construction side of the standard. Again, I provided a link there. Once the webinar is available, or I'm sorry, the PowerPoint is available, you could go directly to that link, or you could just go to the OSHA website and look it up. Basically, what I want to do is go over the differences with the construction standard as opposed to the general industry. A lot of the requirements are the same, but there are some key differences in the construction standard. And the application, that similar to general industry, it applies the Silica requirements apply any time, does not apply, I'm sorry, if there's objective data to show that exposures can never exceed the action level. And what is construction work? In general, I provided the definition out of the standard there, out of OSHA's standard. Basically, I know this is really a real general definition, but it's any work for construction, alteration, or repair, including painting and decorating. So I highlighted 6 of probably the most noticeable differences from the general industry standard. The compliance dates, we already went over that, but I'm going to reiterate on the next slide. There's a few differences in the written exposure control plan compared to the general industry standard. There's a requirement for a competent person, which is not part of general industry. There's also a provision or a table of specified exposure control methods included in the construction standard. The trigger for medical surveillance is different in the construction versus the general industry, and there's a slight difference in the employee notification of monitoring results. So for the compliance dates, now I put the first date there in red because, as I said earlier, that's just around the corner, and by the 6/23 of 2017, all obligations have to be met with the exception of the sample analysis requirement, and that requirement may not even apply depending on what type of tasks the construction project involves. But when I say may not apply, I mean the methods of sample analysis may not apply, but the other obligations will have to be met. And then by 6/23/2018, for the companies where there is required air sampling, those requirements, the methods of sample analysis requirement will be in effect. So for the written exposure control plan, it has to address the same information as a GI standard. In addition to, it has to describe procedures for restricting access into work areas. The objective there, or I guess the logic is, on a construction site, it's not a fixed location like in a factory or somewhere like that, where you can delineate an area and segregate the physically prevent people from walking in. On a lot of construction sites, you may have multiple employers with employees that they're moving and walking around, and so you have to devise a way to make sure that that somebody is going to be able to control access for employees going into an area where they should not be. And it's not just your own employees; it could be employers of or employees of subcontractors or outside employees that may be on the site as well. So the competent person requirement is primarily to ensure that that the work area or the areas that are subject to the requirements of the standard are controlled and kept isolated in a way that people are not walking into those types of areas when they're not authorized or properly protected to walk into such areas. So the competent person, again, that's the second difference from the general industry standard. You have to designate a competent person that would have the authority or would be required to inspect the work area, but also would ensure that the exposure control plan is implemented properly and that they would have the authority to make changes or stop the job if necessary until provisions are put into place to make sure that people are following the requirements of your exposure control plan. And the definition of the competent person is provided here. This is right out of the standard. Really, there's two keys there. They're capable of identifying the hazards, and they have the authority to correct whatever may need corrected. Again, whether it's access to the work area, whether it's non-compliance with the exposure control plan, if somebody is not wearing a respirator, if that's a requirement, or not using provided ventilation or water attachments, etc. So again, a competent person has to be available and adequately trained and have the appropriate authority to ensure that the exposure control plan is being followed. Okay, another key difference with the construction standard is within the standard there is a table that includes specified exposure control methods, and basically what that is it identifies 18 common tasks and equipment that are used in construction where silica is produced. The tasks listed are very specific, and the table includes exactly what has to be done to ensure that additional monitoring does not have to be completed. So for companies that are eligible or for tasks that are eligible under this requirement, you don't have to do exposure monitoring as long as the implementation or the requirements are completely and fully implemented. For tasks that are not listed within the table, in those cases, then it would fall back to doing exposure monitoring and requiring whatever protective measures would be identified based on that exposure monitoring. So the table that contains the specified exposure control methods. As I mentioned, there are 18 specific tasks listed. This is an example of one, and this is verbatim right out of the table. It's actually the first one listed. And so it gives you very specific information, and it's actually it's unique, really, that not too many standards give you this much detail in terms of what specifically you have to do to ensure compliance, and in this case to eliminate the need for doing exposure monitoring. So for a stationary masonry saw under the engineering of work practice control methods, it specifies exactly what type of engineering control is required, which is an integrated water delivery system with continuous water to the blade. And it would also let you know if you need to require a respiratory protection, depending on whether it's less than 4 hours or more than 4 hours of exposure time. So in this case, as long as you use the saw that's equipped with the water feed and you maintain that saw in accordance with manufacturer's instructions, you don't need to provide respiratory protection. Some additional requirements for the specified exposure control methods, and these are more general, but for tasks that are performed indoors or in enclosed areas, the ventilation provided has to minimize visible airborne dust. And then for wet methods, again, the water provided has to be sufficient to minimize the release of visible dust. I know those are somewhat subjective, but it gives you a guideline. If you can see the dust, then you need either more water or more ventilation. Some of the items listed in that table, one of the control methods listed is a requirement for an enclosed cab or booth, and that would be typically for excavation equipment or any equipment where an employee would be within the exposed area but inside a cab. And for the specific task where the enclosed cab or booth is a requirement, the cab in general has to be climate controlled. It has to be under positive pressure. The fresh air supplied to the cab has to be filtered to a certain level, and obviously it has to be maintained properly, sealed properly, etc. So for those tasks that require an enclosed cab or booth, those aspects have to be maintained and in place for you to be able to use that type of booth or cab. Okay, another difference in the construction versus a general industry standard is the medical surveillance trigger. In general industry, it's required whenever the exposures exceed the action level for 30 or more days per year. And in the construction standard, the medical surveillance has to be provided if a respirator is required for 30 or more days per year, as opposed to basing it on the exposure level. For construction tasks where the specified exposure control methods are not applicable, if tasks that are not listed in the table, for example, and you do have to do exposure monitoring, or you do some type of exposure assessment, for general industry, the employees for which the monitoring was completed have to be notified within 15 working days after the exposure assessment of the results. And in construction, it's 5 working days rather than 15 working days. So it's, and I'm sure that's because construction jobs, in a lot of cases, are short term. So that the amount of time to let the employees know what the results were is reduced. Okay, now that covers the general requirements of the Silica, the revised Silica standard. And like I said earlier, this was an overview, and there are a lot more details within the standards themselves. One area in particular is medical surveillance. There's specific documentation that needs to be provided from the physician to the worker, and from the physician to the company, and limitations on what, from a privacy standpoint, what can be disclosed. So that's something, if you are subject to that requirement, you want to make sure you look into that, the details on that, and make sure you understand what needs to be provided. So moving on, the OSHA Focus 4 Hazards campaign. Just to briefly go over what this is, it's primarily a construction, actually not primarily, it is a construction related program or emphasis program. And it's a joint effort that was put together by OSHA and the construction industry partners in Region 3. It started in February of this year, and it's focusing on the 4 leading hazards that result in construction fatalities. As you can see there, falls, electrocutions, struck by objects, and caught in between objects. And there's a representation of those causes and how much they contribute to construction-related fatalities. As you can see there, 39% of construction fatalities are due to falls. Struck by causes 10%, electrical is 9%, and caught in between is 7%. But on the left there, 937 construction workers were fatally injured in 2015. So that's pretty important stuff to look at, in particular considering that those 4 causes were responsible for 64.2% of those fatalities. If you're interested in participating, what the program entails is doing weekly toolbox talks, and those are available via email from the region, and also share the program information with colleagues, trade groups, and anybody that you know that's involved in the construction industry. And you can also provide feedback to the local area office in care of the compliance assistance specialist for that office, to let them know how it's going, and if maybe you have ideas to improve the program, or maybe ideas for additional programs. But so it's a worthwhile campaign, and again, it started in February and it'll run through till May. And I'm just going to go over briefly our program. I think probably a lot of the people that are in attendance are familiar with our program, but for those who are not, we're based out of IUP in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and we're primarily available for small and medium-sized businesses, which are defined there, 250 employees at a given site, or 500 within a corporate entity. And in high hazard industries and more hazardous operations get priority, but we don't turn down anybody regardless of hazard level, but in terms of scheduling, we have to prioritize based on those issues. And even large businesses are available or are able to request our service, but in most cases, for larger businesses, we would limit the scope because larger business does typically they have more resources, and but you're welcome to make a request even if you're a larger business. And as you can see there, we don't issue citations. We don't. There's no penalties. There's no sharing of information that we identify in a given workplace. So for any company that is interested in having a consultation, once you make a request, the only stipulation is that you have to agree to correct any serious hazards or imminent dangers that we may identify during the visit. And the last item there, there's a requirement to refer to enforcement in cases where if an employer does not correct a serious hazard or imminent danger, those are extremely rare. We are a voluntary program, and obviously you wouldn't request our service if you didn't want to know what needed to be corrected and to take the action to correct such hazards. So we do work with you through the whole process in terms of if we identify hazards that require, if you need sample written programs, sample even some PowerPoint presentations if you've got training issues. So we do work with you the whole way through the process to make sure that you have every opportunity to correct any serious hazards that we would find during the visit. And there's no cost for our service. And for companies that have us in, it doesn't remove you from OSHA's radar, but while you're working with us, there's temporary visit in progress status, but even after the fact, it does help you identify and correct violations that could be cited during an OSHA inspection, and ultimately reduce injuries, reduce damages, etc., and save you money down the road. And morally, you want to keep your workplace as safe as possible, and it's a free resource that gives you a way to do that without the threat of a citation. And as I said, we do work with you as much as possible to ensure that any hazards get corrected. And last paragraph there, on average we find 7 serious and other than serious hazards during a visit, which would save an employer roughly $87,000 in fines if you were cited for those hazards that we would find and help you get corrected prior to any potential OSHA citation. And there's our contact information, our website. We're on Facebook and Twitter as well. So like I said earlier, any chat questions that were submitted, we will have them posted to our website within 7 days. And I thank you for attending, and I hope you have a good day, and hopefully the roads improve later on this afternoon. So thanks again, and have a good day.